by photographic evidence and eyewitness testimonies. So we get to the report, the big report. This is part 2 of the official conspiracy theory. It's 42 sub-reports and 10,000 pages. It's only for the Twin Towers still, so it's growing. Like others, it's focused only on the political story. They never considered anything like demolition. And again, they're largely the same people as FEMA. Question I asked was, did they use the standards, since they're the National Institute of Standards, did they use the standards for fire investigation that we have? There's at least 2 areas where I know they did not. It's important in Section 6.5 to remember that conflict of interest should be avoided. And NIST used specialists and contractors who were dependent on government contracts or on the official story itself. Section 12.4 says unusual residues could arise from thermite, magnesium, other pyrotechnic materials. And NIST's report, as far as I know, does not mention FEMA's puzzling sulfur residue. Maybe it's a part that I haven't read, but I've gone through a significant part of it. So our focus today, though, is to look at what they told us about collapse of the buildings and what should have been done to prevent that. So goals 1 and 3 of their 4 goals. And we're going to look at NIST's approach in their final story. They had 5 methods that they told us they used to investigate, and they have essentially 7 steps to their collapse theory. So the 5 investigation methods were A through E: review of documents, interviews with eyewitnesses, analysis of steel, laboratory tests, and finally computer simulations, which you might find they relied on a little more heavily at the end. So, did they review the most important documents? In my opinion, they did not. Did they review many of the important, relevant design claims that had been reported in the mid-'60s when the buildings were first being talked about? No, they did not, as far as I can see. Did they review fire resistance test data? The columns and the floors for tall buildings have to be tested for fire resistance by a company like Underwriters Laboratories. But no, those documents came up missing. And did they review Skilling's fire resistance analysis that he talked about? No, those documents also came up missing. What were the original design claims I'm talking about? The first one's just kind of a general one. It says the World Trade Center towers would have an inherent capacity to resist unforeseen calamities. For the perimeter columns, live loads on these columns can be increased more than 2,000% before failure occurs. And finally, they said one could cut away all the first-story columns on one side, that's on the bottom where the load is very heavy, and partway from the corners of the perpendicular sides, and the building could still withstand design live loads and a 100-mile-per-hour wind from any direction. That's quite a claim, and we're going to get to that. So were the World Trade Center steel components tested for fire resistance? NIST said they found no documents, but yet they also say in their report that the buildings were rated as Class 1B. They actually say the buildings were designed as Class 1A, but yet finally rated as Class 1B mainly for the sprinkler system. But 1B does have 3 hours of fire resistance for columns and 2 hours for floors. So if they have that rating, certainly they must have some documentation. Underwriters Laboratories Chief Executive Officer told me that UL had tested the steel to the New York City Code. This would have been 40 years ago, this testing would have occurred, before any of us had worked there. And the Port Authority said there are no test records in our files. Well, if the steel components, the columns, or the floor assemblies had been tested for fire resistance, as they should have, it would have been tested according to a standard called ASTM E119. That standard is where these components or assemblies are placed in a furnace, and that furnace is brought up to high temperature according to a time temperature curve. In this case, 2,000 degrees is the target, and as many as 8 hours is used. The way they do it is that for a floor, and we'll see a little bit of the pictures of this, they'll create a furnace underneath the floor where it's fireproofed, and then they'll end the test when the top outside of the furnace has reached a certain temperature. And then If that took 111 minutes, then they'll give the rating of 1.5 hours. If it took 58 minutes, like it did for one of theirs, they give it 3/4 of an hour because it didn't reach 1 hour. Okay? So what were UL's comments on testing the World Trade Center steel? This is a little bit more about my story. In September of 2001, Loring Knobloch, UL CEO, told our staff in South Bend at least, and I'm sure he told many others, that UL had certified the steel used in the World Trade Center. He told us we should be proud of how long these buildings had stood because of that. In November of 2003, I asked Knobloch in writing about UL's involvement, and he responded in writing in December confirming these details. He said, "We tested the steel with all the required fireproofing on, and it did beautifully." He said, "As we do not do follow-up service on this kind of product, we can give an opinion only on the test sample, which was indeed properly coded." He said, "We tested the code requirements, and the steel clearly met those requirements and exceeded them." As time went on, they changed their mind on all that. And the question is our public safety guardian lying to us? In August of 2004, they tested models of the floor assemblies. And you'll see pictures, but the floors were barely affected. They did sag a little bit in certain spots. They did not collapse. And Loring Knobloch resigned that same month. I can't say they're connected, but it is interesting. In October of 2004, the report update, which was supposed to be their final draft, was not their final draft, showed up, and I questioned it the next month in my letter to NIST. UL quickly backtracked when my questions became public, saying there was no evidence any firm tested the steel. I was on the front page of my local hometown newspaper. This is what they told them. They played only a limited role in the investigation afterwards, but prior to that, they had been right in the middle of these activities. Okay. So that's review of documents. What was NIST's performance on interviews? NIST started planning for eyewitness interviews in April 2003, which was 7 months after the investigation started, and 19 months after September 11th, so not very timely. By October, they still had not done any interviews, and more importantly, they could not even get access to the New York City interviews that had been done right after September 11th. And this is a federal investigation, so New York City finally agreed to allow NIST access to their original interviews by December of 2003. And you can read about this on NIST's World Trade Center website. They have a flow of announcements, public announcements. Oh, they finally allowed us to look at the interviews. Great. But only in the New York City offices, which is familiar because the 9/11 Commission ran into similar types of things where they could only go to certain offices, they couldn't take notes, couldn't make recordings. Okay. So it's similar. I won't read all of these, but these are some of the eyewitness interviews that eventually did come out after the NIST report came out. It talked about charges on certain floors, secondary devices. They thought it was an explosion. We thought there was an internal detonation, just like when they demolish a building. And of course, these go on. It seemed like when they blow up these buildings. So it looks like implosions, explosives, synchronized, deliberate kind of thing. So these are the eyewitnesses that weren't brought into the report. How about analysis of steel? Well, we talked about most of the steel evidence was destroyed via a decision by Richard Tomasetti, Charles Thornton's partner. But 236 samples were saved for testing, which is 0.3%. NIST did some tests on these samples. First, most important and informative test they did was something called a paint deformation test, where they showed that despite